Okay, welcome back. I'm Peter Lotz from the Copenhagen Business School, and this is the second of 3 lectures on competitive analysis. In the first lecture, I presented the concepts of competition and monopoly. In this lecture, I will discuss how to deal with competition. First, I will look at competition from companies supplying products similar to you. And secondly, I will home in on challenges that might stem from suppliers, customers, and other players in the competitive landscape. So in this lecture, you will learn about generic ways to handle competition from both rivals and other businesses that might be able to steal some of the earnings that you're hoping for. To start from one of the cases in this course, in the first lecture we realized that DigiRehab is not in a position of monopoly. That would have been nice, but there seems to be a competitor with a similar offering. So what can DigiRehab do about that? That's not a simple question to answer. In reality, there are tons of strategies to pursue. But from a generic point of view, many of them can be organized in 2 archetype strategies. In general, strategy theory offers 2 main options. One is to beat the competitors on price. This strategy is also known as cost leadership. The other is to sustain or develop a product that in some aspect is better than the competing products. This strategy is known as differentiation. The first option, cost leadership, is usually adopted by producers which have certain advantages in cheap production or in other ways may be able to offer cheap products. Low-cost airlines and discount grocery stores are examples. For DigiRehab to opt for a low-price strategy would be difficult and uninteresting for several reasons. First of all, because the price that the customer would look at is not the cost of the DigiRehab software, but the total cost of the rehabilitation of the patient. So the software itself is only going to be a small part of the total cost. So lowering the price of the software might not change the cost to the buyer in any major sense. But if cost leadership does not work for DigiRehab, the second option, differentiation, should be considered. So DigiRehab should be better than iCure, at least in some aspects. Of course, it would be fantastic if the DigiRehab product were better than iCure in all dimensions. That would give DigiRehab a chance to conquer the entire market. Reality shows that that is very rarely possible. So a more pragmatic option is to be different so that some customers in some situations find DigiRehab better than iCure. Maybe the DigiRehab training programs are better for young patients than for older patients, for certain losses of functionality than other losses, for municipalities which have a certain IT platform or something else. So the idea of differentiation is not necessarily to be better than your opponent in all dimensions. You could specialize in some areas and allow your opponent to specialize in other areas. As an oversimplified example, if the software were to run on a smartphone, you could make an application for Android and your opponent could do the same for iPhone. In that case, it would not harm you if your opponent lowered the price on his product because your Android customers would not buy his iPhone application anyway, despite the lower prices. What would be the result of such differentiation? Both of you could serve a market where your product is unique and where you are somewhat shielded from competition. Remember that in the first lecture I claimed that a small protected market usually is better than a big market with competitors. This is why. You want to be a monopolist. And remember that basically any difference between the 2 products could do the trick. You could specialize in patient groups, in training programs, in different organizational structures with your customers. You could specialize in geography, or you could specialize in small municipalities versus big. Notice here that your competitor usually would not mind, at least not if the alternative is heads-on competition in the entire market. This is why such divisions of the market often are tacitly agreed upon. This is a mutually beneficial situation. Of course, the situation is not entirely stable. A new company may cause trouble, or a change in customer preferences can eliminate certain advantages. Say if Android phones outcompete iPhones. All in all, to differentiate is usually a good idea. But the position of both players must be constantly developed and reinforced. Otherwise, the situation of truth may quickly break down and wind up in hefty competition. And it's obvious that sharing a competitive market is less interesting than dominating half of such a market. Having now talked a lot about your competitors, it's time to look at some of the other players in the field. Let's assume that the strategy of differentiation was successful and that you're serving a specific segment of the market without any serious competition. So you are some kind of a monopolist. However, it turns out that even a monopolist can have a hard life. Not having any competitors is in fact not a sufficient condition for being able to charge monopoly prices. So let us reintroduce the two types of players in the competitive landscape that I've already mentioned, namely suppliers and customers. We will take suppliers first. Usually we think about suppliers in terms of bulk products like oil, steel, wheat and the like. But suppliers may actually deliver very refined and valuable parts of your product. I once analyzed the industry of hearing instruments. It had really many interesting features. There were only a handful of producers, 3 of them actually Danish, and while they of course weren't a monopoly each of them, they lived a life as a cozy oligopoly, which is a term for an industry with a handful of producers. They did not compete heads-on, and so most of them earned a nice profit. But there was another player in this field which earned even more. You should know that a hearing instrument is basically amplifying sound that is picked up by a microphone and transmitted through a speaker. So all hearing instruments need mics and speakers. Now, where did these parts come from? Well, they were almost all produced by a certain supplier, and this particular supplier was much more profitable than the hearing aids producers themselves. That company was a real monopoly and it charged very high prices. Think about PayPal again. Imagine if the code needed to write the software for PayPal was owned by, say, Microsoft. In that case, PayPal would have had to share its profits with Microsoft as some kind of supplier. Or imagine that PayPal would run only on Mac computers. Here Apple would have had a good chance to extract substantial profits from PayPal, as it does on apps in the App Store. For GG Rehab, such problems are not obvious, but do remember that also a person can be a supplier. If only one person knows how to design the training programs, he or she obviously will have a good chance to get a good share of the profits. Or think about the providers of capital. If you are desperate for capital, you can rest assured that you'll be going to pay a high price for that input. The lesson here is that if a critical supplier is a monopolist, you're locked up with him. And even if you're yourself a monopolist, he can steal a good part of your profits. Perhaps not surprisingly, the same logic applies to customers. In many markets, you'll have tons of individual customers. But in many other markets, you can find only few customers. If you can sell your product only to Airbus or Boeing, you can be pretty sure that they will not allow you to earn much. The same goes if you deliver to large chains of supermarkets or to governments. Prices of medicine can be set directly by governments if they want to. And actually, here GG Rehab may have a problem. If the only customer is the public sector, it can be difficult to obtain a reasonable price. So don't be surprised if the municipalities will start bargaining on the price as soon as you launch your product. That's actually why it may make sense to try to agree on some price even before you begin to invest in the development of the product. The combined message of a look at suppliers and customers is that you should be aware that strong suppliers or customers can be nasty. What else can go wrong? Well, think about the situation where you actually are a monopolist and not in the pocket of a nasty supplier or customer. There are two additional threats that the monopolist need to be aware of. One is whether some other player could actually start producing a clone of your product. The other is whether your customers could see themselves using a totally different way of meeting their needs. In both situations, the threats will materialize in a higher likelihood if you set a higher price. Therefore, they are limiting your profits. So in the first instance, if you're confident that your product is so unique that you can easily charge a price which is much higher than your cost, it could well be that somebody out there realized that even if it would take them more resources than it takes you, they might start producing and offering a similar product. Your success will function as a flypaper for other businesses. The threat of new entry is always a latent pressure on price. In the other instance, customers might well appreciate your product, but if it gets too expensive, they will find other solutions. If you offer some hardware, say a crane, that relieves personnel in a hospital for manual work, your product can only charge a price which represents the savings on labor that your product produces. And if you raise your price, or the price of labor falls, your sales will decline, because it's cheaper to use labor than your crane. As a complicated example, think about Apple's attempt to create a proprietary digital music service with iTunes. It did target a large market, and Apple was initially successful. But when customers discovered the convenience of digital music, they rather quickly substituted iTunes with streaming. Streaming is even more convenient than iTunes and other MP3-like services. So, while initially successful, iTunes has faded over the recent years. All of this talking about the competitive landscape has been summarized in a famous little framework called Porter's 5 Forces. It's named after the founding father of competitive strategy, Michael Porter of Harvard Business School. In essence, as I've explained, it illustrates which problems a company may encounter in the marketplace. Porter's 5 forces present the dark forces, which each of them represent a major threat to the company, and which therefore must be carefully analyzed before a new market is entered. Now, to get back to one of my starting points, why is this not easy? Well, as you can see from my examples, you have to be very knowledgeable about lots of other potential players' situations. And you need to be able to put yourself in their position and foresee their actions. This is why this area of business is called strategy. Your strategy always needs to take into account what your opponents might do. The gameplay is not under your full control. It's like playing chess, but without knowing the exact shape of the game and who you are playing against. Not easy.